The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the sterile hallway of Memorial General Hospital as Dr. Sarah Chen hurried toward the emergency department. Her white coat fluttered behind her, the stethoscope around her neck swaying with each urgent step. She had received the emergency call just minutes ago. A multi-car accident on Highway 95 had resulted in multiple casualties, and the hospital needed all hands on deck. Sarah had been working at Memorial General for 3 years now, ever since completing her residency at Johns Hopkins. At 29, she was one of the youngest attending physicians in the emergency department, but her skills and dedication had earned her the respect of colleagues and patients alike. Her parents, both immigrants from Taiwan, had instilled in her a strong work ethic and an unwavering commitment to helping others. As she rounded the corner toward the emergency department, Sarah noticed a commotion near the main entrance. A security guard she didn't recognize stood blocking the automatic doors, his arms crossed and his expression stern. Behind him, she could see the flashing lights of ambulances in the distance, their sirens growing louder by the second. "Excuse me," Sarah said, approaching the guard with her hospital ID badge clearly visible on her coat. "I need to get through. I'm Dr. Chen, and I'm needed in the ER immediately." The security guard, whose name tag read Johnson, looked her up and down with obvious skepticism. He was a large man in his 50s, with graying hair and a permanent scowl etched on his weathered face. His uniform was crisp and clean, suggesting he took pride in his appearance and authority. "I don't think so, lady," Johnson said, his voice dripping with condescension. "The ER is for medical personnel only. You'll need to use the main entrance like everyone else." Sarah blinked in confusion. She held up her badge again, pointing to the clear designation that read Dr. Sarah Chen, Emergency Medicine. Her photo was right there, along with the hospital logo and all the necessary security features. "This is my badge," she said patiently, though she could feel her heart rate increasing as the ambulance sirens grew closer. "I am medical personnel. I'm an attending physician in the emergency department, and I need to get through right now. Lives are at stake." Johnson barely glanced at the badge before shaking his head dismissively. "Anyone can get one of those fake badges these days. I've seen plenty of people trying to sneak into restricted areas. You don't look like a doctor to me." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had faced this kind of discrimination before, but never in such a critical moment. Her Asian features, petite frame, and youthful appearance had led some people to underestimate her throughout her career, but she had never had someone literally block her from doing her job when lives were hanging in the balance. "Sir, please," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice calm and professional despite the anger building inside her. "I understand you're doing your job, but I really am a doctor here. You can call the ER and verify if you need to, but please let me through. There are injured people who need medical attention." The first ambulance was pulling into the bay now, its red and blue lights painting the walls in urgent colors. Sarah could see the paramedics inside working frantically on their patient. Every second counted in trauma medicine, and every second the security guard delayed her could mean the difference between life and death for someone. "I'm not calling anybody," Johnson said firmly. "And I'm not letting you through. Hospital policy is clear: no unauthorized personnel in the emergency bay. Now move along before I call for backup." Sarah felt a surge of frustration that she had never experienced before. In all her years of medical training and practice, she had never been prevented from helping patients because someone refused to believe she was qualified. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, one of the most qualified people in the building to handle the incoming trauma cases, being treated like a potential criminal. "Listen," she said, her voice taking on an edge of authority that she typically reserved for difficult patients or residents who weren't following protocol. "My name is Dr. Sarah Chen. I graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Medical School. I completed my residency at Johns Hopkins Hospital, one of the top emergency medicine programs in the country. I have been working at this hospital for 3 years, and I have saved countless lives in that emergency room. Now please, step aside and let me do my job." Johnson's expression only grew more stubborn. "I don't care what fancy words you use or what story you tell me. Hospital policy is hospital policy. You're not getting through this door. The second ambulance was pulling in now, and Sarah could see Dr. Martinez, one of her colleagues, rushing out to meet the first one. He glanced in her direction with a confused expression, clearly wondering why she wasn't already inside preparing for the incoming casualties. Sarah pulled out her phone and quickly dialed the emergency department's direct line. It rang twice before being picked up by Linda, one of the head nurses. Memorial General Emergency, this is Linda. Linda, it's Sarah. I'm stuck at the ER entrance. The security guard won't let me through. Can you please tell him I work here? There was a pause on the other end. What? That's ridiculous. Put him on the phone. Sarah held out her phone to Johnson. The head nurse wants to speak with you. Johnson waved his hand dismissively. I don't have time for games. You need to leave this area immediately. By now, a small crowd had begun to gather. Other hospital staff members were arriving for their shifts, and several of them recognized Sarah. Dr. Williams, an older physician who had mentored her during her first year, stopped short when he saw the confrontation. Sarah? What's going on here? Dr. Williams asked, his voice showing concern and confusion. Dr. Williams, thank God, Sarah said with relief. This security guard won't let me into the ER. He doesn't believe I'm a doctor here. Dr. Williams turned to Johnson with an expression of disbelief. Excuse me, but this is Dr. Chen. She's one of our finest emergency physicians. She needs to get through immediately. Johnson looked Dr. Williams up and down. The older physician was a tall, distinguished white man with silver hair and an air of authority that seemed to carry weight. After a moment's hesitation, Johnson's demeanor shifted slightly. Well, sir, if you can vouch for her. Johnson began, but Dr. Williams cut him off. Vouch for her? I shouldn't need to vouch for anyone with proper hospital credentials. This is completely unacceptable. The third ambulance had arrived, and the paramedics were clearly struggling with a critical patient. Sarah could see blood through the ambulance windows and knew that every moment of delay could be fatal. We can sort this out later, Sarah said urgently. Right now, people are dying, and I need to get in there. But Johnson wasn't backing down. Despite Dr. Williams' intervention, he seemed to have dug in his heels. Hospital policy states that all personnel must be properly verified before entering secure areas. I'm just doing my job. Sarah felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. She had dedicated her life to medicine, had worked tirelessly to save lives and help people in their darkest moments. Now, when her skills were desperately needed, she was being prevented from helping because of one man's prejudice and stubbornness. Dr. Williams was growing visibly angry. This is absolutely ridiculous. Dr. Chen has been working here for 3 years. Her badge is legitimate, and she's needed in there right now. More staff members had gathered, including several nurses and technicians who all knew Sarah well. They began voicing their support, explaining to Johnson that she was indeed a doctor and needed to be allowed through. But Johnson seemed immune to their collective testimony. I don't care how many people say they know her. Policy is policy. No one gets through without proper verification. The situation was becoming more surreal by the moment. Here was a group of medical professionals, all vouching for one of their colleagues, being ignored by a security guard who had apparently decided he was the ultimate authority on who could and couldn't practice medicine. Sarah looked at her watch and felt sick to her stomach. It had been nearly 10 minutes since she had first approached the entrance. In trauma medicine, 10 minutes could be the difference between a full recovery and permanent disability, or even between life and death. She could see through the glass doors that the emergency department was in chaos. The nursing staff was overwhelmed, and she could see Dr. Martinez looking around frantically, clearly needing additional physician support for the incoming cases. Please, Sarah said one more time, her voice now carrying a note of desperation. I'm begging you. Just let me through. People are dying in there. Johnson's response was to step closer to the door, making it even more difficult for her to pass. And, I'm telling you for the last time, move along or I'll call for backup. That's when Sarah realized that this wasn't just about policy or procedure. This was about something much deeper and more troubling. Johnson's refusal to accept the word of multiple medical professionals, his dismissive attitude toward her credentials, and his obvious comfort with preventing an emergency physician from helping trauma victims, it all pointed to something beyond simple rule following. Dr. Williams seemed to come to the same conclusion. "This has gone far enough," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I'm calling hospital security to have this man removed from his post." "I am hospital security," Johnson replied smugly. The standoff continued, with more and more staff members arriving and expressing their outrage at the situation. The ambulances kept coming, and Sarah could see the toll that her absence was taking on the emergency department's ability to handle the crisis. What none of them knew was that word of the confrontation had already reached the upper levels of the hospital administration. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the chief of emergency medicine, had been in a meeting when one of the nurses had burst in to report what was happening. Dr. Morrison had immediately contacted hospital security to find out what was going on. When she learned that one of her attending physicians was being prevented from entering the ER during a mass casualty event by a security guard, she had made a decision that would change everything. She picked up her phone and made a call that would bring this situation to a swift and decisive end. As Sarah stood there, watching ambulance after ambulance arrive while being prevented from helping the people inside them, she had no idea that help was already on the way. She had no idea that her ordeal was about to take a dramatic turn, or that the resolution would come in a way that neither she nor Johnson could have anticipated. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway, growing closer by the second. Multiple sets of boots moved in synchronized rhythm, suggesting a coordinated response to the crisis that had developed at the emergency department entrance. Sarah continued to stand her ground, her medical bag in hand and her badge prominently displayed, while Johnson maintained his stubborn blockade of the entrance. Neither of them knew that their confrontation was about to become something much larger than a simple disagreement between a doctor and a security guard. The footsteps grew louder, and Sarah could hear the crackling of radio communications in the distance. Whatever was coming, it was coming fast, and it was coming with authority. The sound of approaching footsteps belonged to Sergeant Marcus Torres of the City Police Department. He had been patrolling the area when the call came through the radio, a disturbance at Memorial General Hospital involving a security issue in the emergency department. Given that there were multiple ambulances on scene with trauma victims, the situation required immediate police intervention to ensure that medical operations could continue unimpeded. Torres was a 15-year veteran of the force, known for his calm demeanor and fair handling of difficult situations. He had worked countless calls at hospitals throughout the city and understood the critical importance of maintaining smooth operations during medical emergencies. As he approached the entrance to the emergency department, he could immediately see that something was seriously wrong. A large crowd of medical personnel had gathered around the entrance, and he could see several ambulances backed up in the bay with paramedics looking frustrated and confused. In the center of the commotion was a security guard blocking the entrance while a young woman in a white coat stood facing him with obvious distress. "What seems to be the problem here?" Torres asked, his voice carrying the authority of his position but remaining calm and professional. Dr. Williams quickly stepped forward to explain the situation. "Officer, this security guard is preventing one of our emergency physicians from entering the ER during a mass casualty event. Dr. Chen has proper credentials and has been working here for 3 years, but this man refuses to let her through." Torres looked at Johnson, then at Sarah, taking in the scene carefully. He could see the hospital badge clearly displayed on Sarah's coat, and he noted the obvious frustration and concern on the faces of the medical staff surrounding them. "Sir," Torres said, addressing Johnson, "can you explain why you're preventing this person from entering?" Johnson straightened up, apparently feeling more confident now that law enforcement had arrived. "I'm following hospital security protocol. This woman doesn't look like a doctor, and I suspect her credentials are fake. I'm protecting the hospital from unauthorized access during an emergency situation." Torres raised an eyebrow at this explanation. He had dealt with many security guards over the years, and he could usually tell the difference between someone following legitimate protocol and someone acting on personal bias. Something about Johnson's demeanor and his phrasing, particularly his comment about Sarah not looking like a doctor, raised red flags. "Ma'am," Torres said, turning to Sarah, "could you show me your identification and credentials?" Sarah immediately handed over her hospital badge, her driver's license, and her medical license that she always carried with her. Torres examined them carefully, noting that everything appeared to be legitimate and properly issued. The hospital badge had all the appropriate security features, and the medical license was current and valid. "These appear to be in order," Torres said, handing the documents back to Sarah. "Dr. Chen, how long have you been working at this hospital?" 3 years, Sarah replied. "I'm an attending physician in the emergency department. All of these people can vouch for me, I work with them every day." Torres looked around at the assembled medical staff, noting their obvious frustration and the way they all seemed to know and support Dr. Chen. Their body language and expressions suggested genuine outrage at what was happening, not the kind of nervous energy he would expect if they were trying to cover for someone who didn't belong there. Meanwhile, inside the emergency department, the situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Dr. Martinez was trying to handle 3 critical trauma cases simultaneously, and the nursing staff was stretched beyond their limits. The delay in getting additional physician support was starting to have serious consequences for patient care. Nurse Linda had been trying to coordinate with the incoming ambulances while also attempting to reach hospital administration about the situation at the entrance. She had worked with Sarah for years and knew that her expertise was desperately needed for the patients they were trying to save. Torres turned back to Johnson. "Can you explain what specific hospital policy prevents a credentialed physician from entering the emergency department during a medical emergency?" Johnson fumbled for a moment before responding. "Well, it's our standard security protocol. We have to verify all personnel before allowing access to secure areas." "And how exactly do you typically verify personnel?" Torres asked, his tone becoming more pointed. "Usually we check their badges and..." "You mean like this badge that appears to be legitimate?" Torres held up Sarah's hospital ID for Johnson to see again. The crowd of medical personnel was growing restless. Several nurses had joined the group, all of whom knew Sarah and were becoming increasingly vocal about the absurdity of the situation. Dr. Williams was checking his watch repeatedly, knowing that every minute of delay could have serious consequences for the patients inside. "Officer Torres," Dr. Williams interjected, "I've been practicing medicine for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like this. Dr. Chen is one of our best emergency physicians. She's board certified, she's saved countless lives, and right now there are trauma victims in there who need her expertise." Torres nodded, his assessment of the situation becoming clearer by the moment. He had dealt with enough cases involving discrimination and abuse of authority to recognize the signs. Johnson's behavior, his dismissive attitude toward multiple medical professionals vouching for Dr. Chen, and his vague explanations about hospital policy all pointed to something beyond legitimate security concerns. "Dr. Chen," Torres said, "have you ever had any problems with hospital security before today?" "Never," Sarah replied firmly. "I've been coming and going through this entrance for 3 years without any issues. I've never had anyone question my credentials or prevent me from doing my job." Torres made a decision. Based on his assessment of the evidence, the legitimate credentials, the testimony of multiple medical professionals, and the suspicious behavior of the security guard, it was clear that Johnson was acting beyond his authority and potentially endangering patient care in the process. "Mr. Johnson," Torres said, his tone becoming more official, "I'm ordering you to step aside and allow Dr. Chen to enter the emergency department immediately." Johnson's face reddened with anger. "You can't order me to do anything. I work for the hospital, not the police department. This is private property, and I have the authority to control access." "Actually," Torres replied calmly, "when your actions interfere with emergency medical services and potentially endanger patient safety, it becomes a matter for law enforcement. You need to step aside right now." But Johnson wasn't backing down. His pride and stubbornness had taken over, and he seemed determined to maintain his position regardless of the consequences. "I'm not moving. This woman is not getting through this door." The situation had reached a critical point. Torres could see that Johnson was not going to comply with his order, and he knew that the medical emergency inside the hospital was only getting worse with each passing minute. He made a decision to escalate his response. Torres reached for his radio and called for backup. "Dispatch, this is Unit 23. I need additional officers at Memorial General Hospital, Emergency Department entrance. We have a security guard interfering with emergency medical operations during a mass casualty event." The response from dispatch was immediate. "Copy that, Unit 23. Units 15, 27, and 31 are en route to your location." Johnson's confidence began to waver as he heard Torres calling for backup. For the first time since the confrontation began, he seemed to realize that his actions might have serious consequences. But his pride kept him planted firmly in front of the entrance. Dr. Williams stepped closer to Torres. "Officer, is there anything else we can do? We have people dying in there, and every minute counts." Torres understood the gravity of the medical situation, but he also knew that he needed to handle this by the book to ensure that there would be no legal complications later. "I understand, Doctor. My backup will be here in just a few minutes, and we'll have this resolved quickly." What none of them knew was that word of the situation had reached even higher levels than anyone realized. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the chief of emergency medicine, had not only contacted hospital security about the incident, she had also placed a call that would bring resources to bear that none of them expected. The sound of additional sirens could be heard in the distance, growing closer by the moment. But these weren't just police sirens, there were other emergency vehicles responding as well, suggesting that the scope of the response was larger than anyone at the scene had anticipated. Sarah stood there, still clutching her medical bag and watching ambulances continue to arrive with patients who needed immediate medical attention. She felt a mixture of frustration, anger, and deep sadness at the situation. All she wanted to do was help people, to use her skills and training to save lives, but she was being prevented from doing so by one man's prejudice and stubbornness. The medical staff around her were becoming increasingly agitated. Several of them had started making phone calls to hospital administration, and others were trying to coordinate with their colleagues inside to manage the crisis as best they could without Sarah's assistance. Johnson stood his ground, but Torres could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the hallway. The security guard was starting to realize that his actions had attracted far more attention than he had anticipated, and that the consequences might be more serious than he had imagined. The first backup police unit arrived within minutes, followed quickly by two more. 3 additional officers approached the scene, and Torres quickly briefed them on the situation. Their presence seemed to finally break through Johnson's stubborn facade, as he began to understand that he was now facing multiple law enforcement officers who were all united in their assessment that his behavior was inappropriate and potentially dangerous. But even as the police presence increased, Johnson maintained his position blocking the entrance. His face had grown pale, and his hands were shaking slightly, but he seemed unable to back down from the stance he had taken. That's when they all heard the sound that would change everything, the distinctive rumble of heavy vehicles approaching at high speed. The sound was different from the police cars and ambulances that had been arriving throughout the confrontation. This was something bigger, something more official, something that carried with it an authority that even Johnson would not be able to ignore. The vehicles were getting closer, and with them came the resolution that Sarah and all the medical staff had been hoping for. But the way it would unfold was something that none of them, not even the police officers, had seen coming. The heavy vehicles that everyone could hear approaching belonged to the hospital's emergency response team, but they weren't coming alone. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison's phone call had reached the office of Captain Rebecca Hayes, the highest-ranking security official for the entire hospital system. Captain Hayes oversaw security operations at 12 hospitals across the metropolitan area, and when she received word that one of her guards was interfering with emergency medical operations, she had immediately mobilized a full response team. Captain Hayes was a former military police officer who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before transitioning to civilian security work. She had zero tolerance for security personnel who abused their authority or acted in ways that could endanger public safety. When she learned that a guard was preventing a credentialed physician from helping trauma victims, she knew she had to respond with overwhelming force to ensure the situation was resolved immediately and permanently. The first vehicle to arrive was a black SUV with "Hospital Security Supervisor" emblazoned on the sides. Behind it came two more security vehicles, followed by a mobile command unit that Captain Hayes used for coordinating responses to major incidents. The convoy pulled up to the emergency department entrance with their emergency lights flashing, creating an impressive display of official authority. Captain Hayes stepped out of the lead vehicle, her crisp uniform and commanding presence immediately drawing everyone's attention. She was a tall, athletic woman in her early 40s, with short brown hair and steel-gray eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the scene before her. The insignia on her uniform clearly indicated her high rank within the hospital security hierarchy. Behind her emerged 7 additional security officers, all of whom wore uniforms that were distinctly different from Johnson's. Their badges and equipment were more sophisticated, and their bearing suggested extensive training and professionalism. These were members of the hospital's elite emergency response team, called in to handle the most serious security incidents. Johnson's face went white as he recognized Captain Hayes. Every security guard in the hospital system knew her reputation, and her presence at this scene meant that his actions had attracted attention at the highest levels of the organization. "What exactly is happening here?" Captain Hayes asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Sergeant Torres stepped forward to brief her. "Captain, we have a hospital security guard who is preventing a credentialed physician from entering the emergency department during a mass casualty event. Multiple medical personnel have vouched for Dr. Chen's identity and credentials, but your guard refuses to allow her access." Captain Hayes looked at Sarah's badge, examined her credentials, and listened as Dr. Williams and several other medical staff members explained the situation. Her expression grew darker with each detail of Johnson's behavior. "Guard Johnson," Captain Hayes said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade, "step away from that entrance immediately." For the first time since the confrontation began, Johnson's resolve seemed to crack. "Captain Hayes, I was just following protocol. This woman didn't look like she belonged, and I was protecting the hospital." "You were following protocol?" Captain Hayes interrupted, her voice rising. "What protocol tells you to ignore legitimate hospital credentials? What protocol allows you to override the testimony of multiple medical professionals? What protocol gives you the authority to prevent emergency medical care during a trauma situation?" Johnson stammered, unable to provide a coherent answer. The crowd of medical personnel watched in silence as one of the most powerful security officials in the hospital system dressed down the guard who had caused so much trouble. "Dr. Chen," Captain Hayes said, turning to Sarah with a completely different tone, "on behalf of the entire hospital security department, I apologize for this inexcusable interference with your duties. Please proceed to the emergency department immediately." But Johnson still hadn't moved away from the entrance. Despite being confronted by his ultimate superior and surrounded by police officers, he seemed frozen in place, perhaps paralyzed by the realization of what he had done and what the consequences might be. "Guard Johnson," Captain Hayes said again, her voice now carrying a tone that made everyone present understand that this was not a request, "you will step away from that entrance right now, or you will be physically removed by these officers." The 8 security officers who had arrived with Captain Hayes moved closer to Johnson, their body language making it clear that they were prepared to physically enforce their captain's orders if necessary. These officers were specially trained and equipped to handle difficult situations, and their unified presence created an intimidating display of authority. Johnson finally took a step back, but he still seemed reluctant to completely abandon his position. "I was just doing my job," he said weakly. "No," Captain Hayes replied firmly, "you were abusing your authority and endangering patient safety. That is the opposite of doing your job." Dr. Williams approached Captain Hayes with obvious relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Captain. We desperately need Dr. Chen inside. The trauma victims from the highway accident are in critical condition." Captain Hayes nodded grimly. "Dr. Chen, please go save lives. We'll handle the situation out here." Sarah finally moved toward the entrance, but, as she approached, Johnson made one last attempt to assert his authority. He stepped partially back into her path and said, "I still don't think she should be allowed through without proper verification." That statement proved to be the final straw for everyone present. Captain Hayes' expression turned thunderous, and she made a gesture that brought all 8 of her officers forward simultaneously. "Johnson," she said, her voice now carrying a tone of absolute finality, "you are hereby relieved of duty pending a full investigation. Officers Williams and Rodriguez escort Mr. Johnson to the security office and ensure he remains there until further notice." 2 of the security officers immediately moved to flank Johnson, making it clear that his cooperation was no longer optional. The symbolic power of this moment was not lost on anyone present. Johnson, who had spent the last hour blocking access and claiming authority, was now being escorted away by the very security system he claimed to represent. But Captain Hayes wasn't finished. She reached for her radio and made an announcement that would be heard throughout the entire hospital security network. "All units, this is Captain Hayes. Be advised that Guard Johnson has been relieved of duty for conduct unbecoming and interference with medical operations. Dr. Sarah Chen is an authorized physician in the emergency department and is to be afforded every courtesy and assistance. Any security personnel who have questions about Dr. Chen's credentials should contact me directly." The radio announcement served multiple purposes. It ensured that Sarah would never face this kind of harassment again. It sent a clear message to all security personnel about the consequences of abusing their authority, and it demonstrated to the medical staff that the hospital security leadership took this incident very seriously. As Johnson was escorted away, his face showed a mixture of shame, anger, and fear. He seemed to finally understand that his actions had not only endangered patient care but had also likely ended his career in hospital security. The other security officers maintained professional composure, but their body language suggested they were disgusted by their colleagues' behavior. Sarah finally entered the emergency department, where she was greeted by chaos but also by the relieved faces of her colleagues. Dr. Martinez immediately briefed her on the most critical cases, and she quickly got to work on a trauma patient who had been waiting for surgical evaluation. Outside, Captain Hayes was conducting a thorough debrief with Sergeant Torres and the other police officers. She wanted to understand exactly what had happened and ensure that there would be no repeat of such an incident. "Sergeant Torres," Captain Hayes said, "I want to thank you and your officers for your professional handling of this situation. Your intervention prevented what could have been a much more serious incident." Torres nodded. "Captain, I have to ask, is this kind of behavior typical for your security staff?" Captain Hayes' expression hardened. "Absolutely not. We have strict policies against discrimination and abuse of authority. Johnson's behavior today was completely contrary to everything we stand for and everything we train our officers to do." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Morrison, the chief of emergency medicine, who had finally made it down from her meeting to assess the situation in person. She looked around at the assembled security officers and police, then at the entrance where the confrontation had taken place. "Captain Hayes," Dr. Morrison said, "thank you for responding so quickly. How are we preventing something like this from happening again?" Captain Hayes had clearly been thinking about this question. "Dr. Morrison, I'm implementing several immediate changes. First, all security personnel will undergo mandatory retraining on credential verification and non-discrimination policies. Second, I'm establishing a direct hotline between the emergency department and security command so that any access issues can be resolved immediately. Third, I'm reviewing our hiring and supervision practices to identify how someone with Johnson's attitudes managed to get through our screening process." Dr. Morrison nodded approvingly. "Those sound like excellent steps. I also want to ensure that Dr. Chen receives a formal apology from the hospital administration and that her personnel file reflects her professionalism in handling this difficult situation." Inside the emergency department, Sarah was doing what she did best, saving lives. Despite the trauma and humiliation she had endured, she was focused entirely on her patients. Her colleagues marveled at her ability to compartmentalize the incident and concentrate on providing excellent medical care. Dr. Williams joined her at one of the trauma bays. "Sarah, I can't tell you how sorry I am about what happened out there. In 30 years of medicine, I've never seen anything like it." Sarah looked up from the patient she was examining. "Thank you for standing up for me, Dr. Williams. I know you didn't have to do that." "Of course I did," he replied. "We're colleagues, and, more than that, you're an excellent physician who was being treated shamefully. No one should have to go through what you experienced today." Meanwhile, back outside, Captain Hayes was wrapping up her discussion with the police officers. She had obtained their report and assured them that the hospital would be conducting a thorough investigation into the incident. "Sergeant Torres," she said, "if you need any additional information for your report, please don't hesitate to contact me directly. We want to ensure that there's a complete record of what happened here today." Torres handed her his business card. "Captain, I appreciate your professionalism in handling this. It's clear that you run a tight ship, and I respect the way you handled one of your own when he stepped out of line." As the police officers prepared to leave, Captain Hayes gathered her remaining security team for a brief meeting. She wanted to make sure that every officer understood the significance of what had happened and the expectations going forward. "I want all of you to understand something," she told them. "What Johnson did today was not just wrong, it was dangerous. He interfered with medical care during an emergency, he discriminated against a qualified physician, and he brought shame on our entire department. This is not who we are, and it's not what we stand for." The officers listened intently, clearly understanding the gravity of the situation and their captain's expectations. "From this day forward," Captain Hayes continued, "I want every one of you to remember that our job is to support the medical mission of this hospital, not to interfere with it. If you ever have questions about someone's credentials or authority, you escalate to supervision. You do not take matters into your own hands, especially when lives are at stake." As the crowd outside the emergency department finally began to disperse, it was clear that this incident would have lasting consequences far beyond the immediate resolution. Changes would be made, policies would be updated, and people would remember the day when one person's prejudice and stubbornness was confronted by the full force of institutional authority. 3 hours later, the emergency department had returned to its normal rhythm, but the aftershocks of the confrontation continued to reverberate throughout Memorial General Hospital. Sarah had successfully treated 6 trauma patients from the highway accident, and all of them were now stable and receiving appropriate care. Despite the emotional toll of her earlier experience, she had performed at her usual high level, earning praise from colleagues and gratitude from patients and their families. Dr. Morrison had personally visited each patient that Sarah had treated, checking on their progress and ensuring that the delay in her arrival hadn't caused any lasting harm. Fortunately, the quick response of the other medical staff had minimized the impact, but everyone understood that the situation could have been much worse. In the hospital's administrative offices, a very different kind of emergency response was taking place. Hospital CEO Margaret Patterson had called an urgent meeting with department heads to address what she saw as a serious institutional failure. The conference room was filled with the heads of security, human resources, medical staff, and legal departments, all trying to understand how such an incident could have occurred and what needed to be done to prevent it from happening again. "I want to be very clear about something," CEO Patterson said to the assembled group. "What happened today was not just an isolated incident of poor judgment by one employee. It represents a systemic failure that allowed someone with obvious bias to be placed in a position where he could interfere with patient care." Captain Hayes provided a detailed briefing on Johnson's employment history. She had spent the afternoon reviewing his personnel file and conducting preliminary interviews with his supervisors and colleagues. What she found was troubling. Johnson had received multiple complaints about his attitude and behavior over the past 18 months, Captain Hayes reported. Several medical staff members had mentioned that he seemed suspicious of young physicians, particularly women and minorities. There were also reports that he had made inappropriate comments about certain doctors not looking the part. The head of Human Resources, Janet Rodriguez, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Why weren't these complaints escalated? Why wasn't disciplinary action taken? Captain Hayes' expression was grim. That's what we're trying to determine. It appears that his immediate supervisors either didn't take the complaints seriously or failed to report them through proper channels. We're conducting interviews with all security personnel who worked with Johnson to get the complete picture. CEO Patterson was taking notes throughout the briefing, her expression showing both anger and determination. I want a complete review of our security department's hiring practices, training protocols, and supervisory procedures. If there are other employees with similar attitudes, I want them identified and removed. The legal department head, David Kim, raised a concern that everyone was thinking about. We need to be prepared for potential litigation from Dr. Chen. What Johnson did could be considered discrimination, and the fact that it interfered with her ability to practice medicine makes it particularly serious. Dr. Chen has every right to file a lawsuit, CEO Patterson replied, and if she does, we'll cooperate fully and accept responsibility for what happened. But our primary focus right now needs to be making sure this never happens again. Meanwhile, down in the security office, Johnson was sitting in a small conference room with 2 human resources representatives and a union representative. His termination hearing was already underway, and it was not going well for him. Mr. Johnson, said HR Director Rodriguez, you were provided with clear policies regarding credential verification and non-discrimination. Can you explain why you chose to ignore the legitimate credentials of Dr. Chen and the testimony of multiple medical professionals? Johnson's attempts to justify his actions were becoming increasingly desperate and contradictory. I thought her badge might be fake. I've heard about people sneaking into hospitals. Have you ever encountered a fake hospital badge in your 3 years of employment here? Rodriguez asked. Well, no, but have you ever prevented any other physician from entering the emergency department based on suspicions about fake credentials? Johnson hesitated before answering. Not exactly, but Mr. Johnson, yes or no, have you ever prevented any male physician or any white physician from entering the emergency department based on concerns about their credentials? The question hung in the air like a challenge that Johnson couldn't answer without incriminating himself further. His silence spoke volumes about his motivations and attitudes. The union representative, Tom Bradley, was trying his best to defend his member, but even he seemed uncomfortable with Johnson's behavior. Look, maybe Johnson used poor judgment, but termination seems harsh for a first offense. Mr. Bradley, Rodriguez interrupted, this wasn't poor judgment. This was deliberate interference with emergency medical care based on discriminatory attitudes. If Dr. Chen's delay in treating patients had resulted in serious complications or death, your member could have been facing criminal charges. Back in the emergency department, Sarah was finishing up her shift and preparing to go home. The events of the day had left her emotionally drained, but she was proud that she had been able to focus on her patients and provide them with excellent care despite the circumstances. Dr. Williams approached her as she was updating her patient charts. Sarah, how are you holding up after everything that happened today? I'm okay, Sarah replied, though her voice carried a weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. I just keep thinking about how many other people might be facing this kind of treatment without anyone standing up for them. Dr. Williams nodded thoughtfully. You know, what happened today has started conversations throughout the hospital. People are talking about unconscious bias, about assumptions we make about who belongs in certain roles. I think your experience, as terrible as it was, might lead to some positive changes. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of CEO Patterson, who had come down to speak with Sarah personally. This was highly unusual. CEOs rarely visited the emergency department, and, when they did, it was typically for formal events or serious crises. Dr. Chen, CEO Patterson said, I wanted to apologize to you personally for what happened today. What you experienced was completely unacceptable, and I want you to know that we're taking comprehensive action to ensure it never happens again. Sarah was touched by the CEO's personal attention, but she had concerns that went beyond her own experience. Miss Patterson, I appreciate your apology, but I'm worried about whether this kind of thing is happening to other people, staff members, visitors, patients, who don't have the support that I had today. CEO Patterson was impressed by Sarah's response. Even after being subjected to discrimination and harassment, her primary concern was for others who might face similar treatment. That's exactly why we're conducting a comprehensive review of all our policies and procedures. We want to identify any systemic issues and address them before they affect anyone else. The CEO handed Sarah her business card. Dr. Chen, I want you to know that you have my personal commitment that this hospital will become a place where everyone is treated with respect and dignity, regardless of their appearance, background, or any other factor. If you ever experience any issues or have suggestions for improvements, I want you to contact me directly. As CEO Patterson left the emergency department, word was already spreading throughout the hospital about Johnson's termination. The speed and decisiveness of the administration's response sent a clear message to all employees about the consequences of discriminatory behavior. In the security department, Captain Hayes was meeting with all off-duty security officers, bringing them in for mandatory retraining sessions. She wanted to ensure that every member of her team understood not only what had happened, but why it was so serious and how they could prevent similar incidents. I want each of you to understand that today's incident has damaged the reputation of our entire department, Captain Hayes told the assembled officers. Johnson's actions reflected poorly on all of us, and it's going to take time and effort to rebuild the trust that was lost. She showed them the hospital's official policies on credential verification, non-discrimination, and emergency procedures. These aren't suggestions or guidelines, they are mandatory requirements that every officer must follow without exception. One of the younger officers raised his hand. Captain, what should we do if we have genuine concerns about someone's credentials? Excellent question, Captain Hayes replied. If you have legitimate concerns, you escalate to supervision immediately. You don't make unilateral decisions to deny access, especially during emergency situations. We have protocols in place for verifying credentials quickly and accurately. The training session continued for 2 hours, covering not just technical procedures but also issues of unconscious bias, cultural sensitivity, and the importance of treating all people with respect and dignity. 3 weeks later, Sarah was working her regular shift when she noticed several changes that had been implemented throughout the hospital. New signage had been posted explaining the credential verification process, additional supervisors had been hired for the security department, and there was a new emphasis on customer service training for all staff members. Most importantly, she had not experienced any further incidents of discrimination or harassment. The other security officers she encountered were uniformly professional and courteous, and several had gone out of their way to be helpful and welcoming. Dr. Williams stopped by during one of her breaks. Sarah, have you heard about the new policies that came out of your incident? Some of them, she replied. I know they've implemented new training requirements and changed some procedures. It's more than that, Dr. Williams said. They've created a new position, Director of Equity and Inclusion, and they're implementing hospital-wide bias training for all employees. Your experience has sparked a real cultural change here. Sarah felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness at this news. She was glad that something positive had come from her ordeal, but she regretted that it had taken such a dramatic incident to bring about necessary changes. 6 months later, Sarah received an invitation to speak at the hospital's annual Diversity and Inclusion Conference. Her story had become a catalyst for broader conversations about bias, discrimination, and the importance of creating inclusive environments in healthcare settings. Standing at the podium in front of hundreds of hospital employees, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The incident with Johnson had been one of the most difficult experiences of her professional life, but it had also led to meaningful changes that would benefit countless others. Today, I want to talk about the power of standing up for what's right. Sarah began her presentation. 6 months ago, one person's prejudice nearly prevented me from helping trauma victims during a medical emergency. But the response from this institution, from police officers, from security leadership, from hospital administration, and from my medical colleagues showed me that when good people unite against injustice, real change is possible. In the audience, Captain Hayes and CEO Patterson listened with pride as Sarah described the improvements that had been implemented throughout the hospital. Both women knew that there was still work to be done, but they also understood that Sarah's experience had marked a turning point in the hospital's culture. As Sarah concluded her presentation, the audience gave her a standing ovation. But, for Sarah, the real victory wasn't the applause or recognition, it was the knowledge that no other physician, nurse, or healthcare worker would have to face what she had faced on that day when one badge commanded 8 officers to stand down and, justice finally, prevailed. The incident had started with one man's prejudice and stubbornness, but it had ended with institutional change, policy reform, and a renewed commitment to treating all people with the respect and dignity they deserved. In the end, that transformation was worth far more than any individual vindication could ever be.